The world in the early 1960s was a tense and uncertain place. World War II was over, but a new conflict had emerged: the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union, recent allies against Nazi Germany, were now locked in an ideological struggle. It was a clash between capitalism and communism, democracy and authoritarianism. Both superpowers possessed nuclear weapons, casting a long shadow over the globe. The fear of nuclear annihilation permeated everyday life. The stakes were incredibly high, with the potential for a small conflict to escalate into a global catastrophe. Trust between the superpowers was almost non-existent. This global standoff played out on multiple fronts: espionage, propaganda, and proxy wars. Every corner of the world became a potential battleground in this high-stakes chess game. The Cuban Missile Crisis, a defining moment in this era, brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. In 1959, a revolution led by Fidel Castro overthrew the US-backed government of Cuba. This was a significant blow to the United States. Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, was now a communist state aligned with the Soviet Union. The US government, alarmed by this development, implemented a trade embargo against Cuba. They also supported covert operations aimed at toppling Castro's regime. These actions only served to push Cuba closer to the Soviet Union. The presence of a communist state so close to US shores was unacceptable to American policymakers. The stage was set for a dangerous confrontation when the Soviet Union decided to secretly deploy nuclear missiles to Cuba. This decision would have far-reaching consequences and push the world to the edge of the abyss. In October 1962, American U-2 spy planes flying over Cuba made a chilling discovery. High-resolution photographs revealed the construction of launch sites for Soviet nuclear missiles. These missiles, capable of reaching the US mainland in minutes, posed an unprecedented threat to American security. The news of the Soviet missiles sent shockwaves through the US government. President John F. Kennedy and his advisors were faced with an agonizing dilemma. A direct military strike against the missile sites could trigger a Soviet retaliation and lead to all-out nuclear war. The world held its breath as the United States and the Soviet Union teetered on the brink. The Cuban Missile Crisis, as it became known, was a 13-day period of intense pressure and agonizing decisions. The fate of the world hung in the balance as the two superpowers stared each other down. Section 4, the key players: Kennedy, Khrushchev, and Castro. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a clash of ideologies and personalities, a high-stakes game of political chess that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Three men, each with their own motivations and calculations, held the fate of the world in their hands. Their decisions, strategies, and missteps would determine the outcome of this perilous confrontation. John F. Kennedy, the young and charismatic President of the United States, was determined to project strength and resolve in the face of Soviet aggression. He was acutely aware that any sign of weakness could have far-reaching consequences. Kennedy's advisors were divided, with some urging a military strike and others advocating for a diplomatic solution. The pressure on Kennedy was immense as he navigated the treacherous waters of international diplomacy. Nikita Khrushchev, the shrewd and sometimes impulsive leader of the Soviet Union, had gambled on placing missiles in Cuba to deter a US invasion and gain leverage in the Cold War. He believed that this bold move would shift the balance of power in favor of the Soviet Union. However, Khrushchev miscalculated the US response and now found himself in a dangerous standoff. The stakes were higher than ever, and the risk of miscalculation could lead to catastrophic consequences. Fidel Castro, the fiery revolutionary leader of Cuba, had welcomed Soviet military aid as a way to protect his fledgling communist regime from US hostility. He saw the Soviet missiles as a necessary deterrent against American intervention. Castro found himself caught in the middle of a superpower confrontation, with his island nation at the epicenter of a potential nuclear conflict. His determination to defend Cuba's sovereignty added another layer of complexity to the crisis. These three men, each with their own agendas and pressures, had to find a way out of the crisis before it escalated into a global catastrophe. The world watched with bated breath as the leaders engaged in intense negotiations, each step fraught with peril. Their decisions, made in the heat of the moment, would shape the course of history. The resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis would not only define their legacies, but also set the stage for future international relations and the ongoing struggle for global supremacy. Section 5, 13 Days of Terror, the world holds its breath. The discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba triggered a period of intense anxiety and fear across the globe. The world was suddenly thrust into a state of high alert, with the spectre of nuclear war looming large over every nation. For 13 agonizing days in October 1962, the world teetered on the edge of catastrophe. The United States and the Soviet Union edged closer to the brink of nuclear war, each side unwilling to back down. The tension was palpable, with every decision carrying the weight of potential global destruction. Newspapers around the world ran banner headlines about the crisis, fueling public anxiety. Every morning, people would rush to their local newsstands, desperate to read the latest updates. Families huddled around their radios and televisions, their faces etched with worry, desperate for any scrap of information. Every broadcast, every news bulletin was dissected and discussed as people tried to make sense of the unfolding drama. The threat of nuclear annihilation felt all too real. The images of mushroom clouds and the devastating power of nuclear weapons were seared into the collective consciousness. In the United States, schools conducted duck-and-cover drills, a grim reminder of the ever-present danger. Preparing children for a potential nuclear attack became a routine part of their education, a stark contrast to the innocence of childhood. People stocked up on supplies, fearing the worst. Grocery stores saw a surge in sales of canned goods, bottled water, and other essentials. The world held its breath, hoping and praying for a peaceful resolution to the crisis. Churches were filled with people seeking solace and divine intervention. The tension was palpable, a heavy weight pressing down on everyone. The uncertainty of the future was a constant source of anxiety, a heavy weight pressing down on everyone. The streets were filled with somber faces, each person lost in their own thoughts and fears. The fate of humanity hung in the balance, dependent on the decisions of a few powerful men. The world watched as President Kennedy and Soviet Premier Khrushchev navigated this perilous situation, dependent on the decisions of a few powerful men. Their choices would determine the course of history, and the stakes could not have been higher. It was a time of unprecedented fear and uncertainty, a stark reminder of the fragility of peace in the nuclear age. The world had never been so close to the brink of destruction, a stark reminder of the fragility of peace in the nuclear age. The Cuban Missile Crisis left an indelible mark on history, a testament to the dangers of nuclear brinkmanship and the importance of diplomacy in maintaining global peace. Section 6. Blockade or invasion, Kennedy's defining moment. President Kennedy faced an agonizing decision. A direct military strike against the missile sites in Cuba carried the risk of a full-blown nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Yet, allowing the missiles to remain in Cuba was unthinkable. After days of intense debate within his administration, Kennedy opted for a middle course. He announced a naval quarantine of Cuba, essentially a blockade to prevent further Soviet shipments of offensive weapons to the island. This action, while less provocative than a direct attack, was still fraught with risk. Any miscalculation, any escalation by either side could have had catastrophic consequences. The world watched and waited on tenterhooks as Soviet ships approached the quarantine line. Kennedy's decision to impose a blockade rather than launch an immediate attack was a pivotal moment in the crisis. It gave both sides a chance to step back from the brink and explore diplomatic solutions. The blockade bought precious time, but the danger was far from over. Section 7. Back channels and ultimatums. The path to resolution. With the world on edge, secret negotiations began between the United States and the Soviet Union. These clandestine discussions were held in utmost secrecy, away from the prying eyes of the media and the public. Both sides recognized the need to find a way out of the crisis, to step back from the abyss. The stakes were incredibly high, and the potential for catastrophic consequences loomed large over every decision. But neither side wanted to appear weak or to compromise their core interests. The balance of power was delicate, and any sign of weakness could have far-reaching implications. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, the president's brother, engaged in back-channel diplomacy with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin. These meetings were held in utmost secrecy, often late at night, to avoid any leaks. These secret talks, away from the glare of publicity, proved crucial in finding a path to resolution. The informal nature of these discussions allowed for more candid exchanges and a better understanding of each side's position. Publicly, however, the rhetoric remained heated. Leaders on both sides continued to make strong statements to maintain their domestic and international standing. Khrushchev sent Kennedy two conflicting messages, one conciliatory, the other demanding the removal of US missiles from Turkey in exchange for the removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba. This dual approach added to the complexity of the negotiations. The situation remained tense, the outcome uncertain. Every move was scrutinized, and the margin for error was virtually non-existent. The world watched and waited as the two superpowers engaged in a dangerous game of brinkmanship. The tension was palpable, and the fear of a potential nuclear conflict was ever present. The stakes had never been higher, the pressure immense. The leaders knew that any misstep could lead to devastating consequences. The fate of the world hung in the balance, dependent on the skills and judgment of a few key individuals. Their ability to navigate this treacherous path would determine the course of history.